And that's it, can you see my wife right there?
She's here somewhere. She's right there.
That's it.
Nice.
Good afternoon, everyone. That was Joey Brink, University Carillonneur, playing from 240 steps above you at the top of the tower. I'm Elizabeth Davenport, Dean of Rockefeller Chapel, and it's my honor to welcome you all to this great chapel today. 62 years ago this month, on April 13th, 1956, the then 27-year-old Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his first Chicago address from this pulpit. The Montgomery bus boycott had begun 4 months earlier. Dr. King's own home had been firebombed just 10 weeks earlier. One of the key organizers of Dr. King's visit that day was Timuel D. with First Unitarian Church, 1 block north of here, a church which, with Rockefeller Chapel, was keenly involved in the burgeoning civil rights movement. Brother Black, as his friend Dr. King called him, is today, at the age of 99, justly known as a living legend in our midst, a historian, storyteller, and continuing activist. It is our very great honor to welcome him today on this momentous 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. Bart Schultz, director of the University of Chicago's Civic Knowledge Project and senior lecturer in philosophy, who has organized today's event, will be engaging Brother Black in conversation. Please join me in giving the warmest of welcomes to them both.
Thank you. Okay. So, can you hear me? Thank you so much, Dean Davenport, for that warm introduction and for all of the support that you and your wonderful colleagues here at Rockefeller Chapel have given this event. Thank yous also go to all the great colleagues and partners who've helped Derek Douglas, the Office of Civic Engagement, Vice Provost Melissa Gilliam, our friends in the news office who made sure you all knew about this event, and many, many more across the university. Thanks also to our deeply valued community partners, the Addie Wyatt Center for Nonviolence Training. They have an event coming up later this evening, by the way. And especially the Rainbow Push Coalition, who first urged us to develop the MLK initiative, as we're calling it, the Civic Knowledge Project's ongoing effort to see that the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is kept alive every day of the year, and his legacy carried forward in a world that needs it as much as ever. Surely all of you here today would like to see peace triumph over violence, dignity triumph over vulgarity, and hope triumph over fear. As Dr. King urged, don't allow anybody to pull you so low as to make you hate them. Don't allow anybody to cause you to lose your self-respect to the point that you do not struggle for justice. Well, our distinguished guest today is indeed a living legend, absolutely amazing, someone who really exemplifies what Dr. King was talking about every single day. He is an example of how to make peace triumph over just violence, dignity over vulgarity, and hope over fear. At 99, going on 100 next December, he is continuing the struggle that he began so many years ago. He's an example to us all, and I'm honored to be here to ask him a few questions today. I'd like to start by asking you to elaborate a bit on your answer in that ABC News interview you gave last week when you were asked, where were you when you heard the news of Dr. King's tragic assassination, and what were your feelings?
Well, my feelings, I was in Gary, Indiana, teaching at Gary Roosevelt High School in Gary. And I was preparing to celebrate my birthday, which would be December the 7th. And I looked at looking at television, I saw this is 1955, I saw...
Oh, okay. You want to go back to your first meeting with Dr. King, when you were first inspired. That's fine, great.
Oh, the first,
yeah.
That was the beginning of the first meeting.
Right.
Because when I saw this handsome, younger man saying from the pulpit of the church in Montgomery and preaching some theme that he had borrowed, I'm tired. And he was tired of segregation. He was tired of discrimination. He was tired of poverty and all those things. He articulated for me a feeling of not being necessarily physically tired, but emotionally tired of discrimination and segregation. He articulated a feeling that I had carried most of my life, but became more, when I was drafted into World War II, and me and fellows from the North did our training. I was subject to training in the South. And we had on our soldier suit, but a civilian white person could tell us where to sit on the bus, where to stand in the line. We were tired. I was particularly tired because in Chicago even, I had faced discrimination in housing, in job opportunities. All of those things came to my feelings. And then I had the experience from going up from Normandy up through France, and there were examples of that, but yet I had to make adjustments to be honorably discharged from the Army. I had to make adjustments. And then while moving on up to what they call the Battle of the Bulge, which had nothing to do with weight, we went into one of the camps, Buchenwald, And I saw people who had been exterminated and brutalized systematically. That carried me back to the memories of my ancestors, my African ancestors. So when I saw Dr. King giving in those kind of terms, I saw my past, the past of millions and millions of other people. So I went to Montgomery, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. I think it was Dexter. Anyway, I met him and others who had participated in the march. And from that point forward, I followed Dr. King reverently because he had exemplified and articulated the feeling. And I was not the only one that was tired. There were Hyde Parkers who were tired. There were other people across the country who were tired. But we were not too tired to walk behind this great man. And I never have gotten tired from that point on in trying to help people to be tired of inequality, of sexism and racism and all those things that separate human beings. Sorry to talk so much.
No.
But memories crowd the corners of my mind. Precious memories of the way we were.
We'll get back to the day King died, but it's better to begin at the beginning here. What was it like to work directly with Dr. King in that way?
Oh, it was something, and I'm sure that I carry the message of many others. It was a pleasure because you felt that sense of dedication and devotion by him to the mission to make things better, and you felt good to be with a man, a person who articulated this so well to so many people. So I was never tired of working with Dr. King. And so I looked forward to it. And of course, the opportunity that we had, and this place was full when he came. And he was not as well known as he later became, but the spirituality that he carried throughout this community. And Rockefeller Chapel was overloaded that particular day.
This is, I mean, you mentioned the spirituality of the experience of working with Dr. King. And that seems particularly relevant today. Our times are as angry as ever. It's difficult not to be incredibly angry, to be activated by so many of the horrible things going on in the world. But Dr. King had a way of dealing with the anger, a very constructive way of dealing with it. Did you find yourself changing as a result of that, becoming more constructive in the way you channeled your anger?
Well, I felt obligated to follow Dr. King, and some of us from the North had to be trained to be nonviolent. Because regardless of race lines, if somebody hits you, you hit them back. But with Dr. King, you felt because of your respect for him, you wouldn't do that. And so in Birmingham and Montgomery and other places where I happened to be with him, I felt But when he came to Chicago and we organized for the march in, what is the name?
Oh, Marquette Park.
Marquette Park. And we had organized with many Catholic sisters and brothers. And when we got into Marquette Park, which was dominantly Catholic in terms of religion, and I heard the vulgarity that was used against fellow Catholics who were walking with us. And then the violence that began to occur. And Dr. King was knocked down, but that remarkable man got up, as he had done before, to forgive those who had brutalized him. And at that point, being in Chicago and being reared like I heard, I said to myself, if one of them hits me, the nonviolent movement is over. I could take it in Birmingham, but not in Chicago. And others who had not gone, they felt that way in the beginning, and they just didn't go. So they could take it there, but not here, even with Dr. King. But he converted people, and that march and he, a young man who was young then but older now, who carried that spirituality forward. A Catholic who was so embarrassed, who was then going to seminary, Catholic seminary, so embarrassed by what he experienced that he has dedicated the rest of his life to following the legacy of Dr. King. Father Pfleger, that you may have heard of and should have, because he is an activist carrying the spirituality and the organizational attitude of Dr. King.
I should mention Father Pfleger of the St. Sabina Faith Community is a great friend of Professor Black's, sends his love to Professor Black and to all of you here today. He has been honored with an invitation to deliver the keynote address at the Lorraine Motel this evening. He is there with Andrew Young, with Reverend Jesse Jackson, so many great leaders of the civil rights movement. Our guest today, however, belongs in that company, as Father Pfleger would be the first to admit. And I think in that context, we see all of these individuals today who are really, as you say, actively carrying on Dr. King's legacy. What does it take to do that? What's your secret? How do you get up every day, hopeful, active, ready to continue this struggle?
Well, one of the things is that young lady that's my wife out there.
Zenobia Black, a hand for her, please.
She supports that activity and participates and has been active ever since we met. In fact, that was one of the ways in which we did meet. We were active, bringing about more equality in the labor movement. And of course, many of the labor people were with Dr. King originally. That was A. Philip Randolph, who many people don't know, threatened a march on Washington in 1941 during the beginning of the World War II. If blacks were not given equal opportunities in jobs that were being provided by the government, there would be a march on Washington. And the president, recognizing that that would be embarrassing to the rest of the world, he issued an executive order that jobs that were militarily created would be equal to everyone. And one of the examples, of course, is the area where Augill Gardens is now, with many others. So Dr. King had a legacy to follow himself, and he followed, but Mr. Randolph was one of the early supporters, along with E.D. Nixon, a brotherhood porter, and that encouraged Dr. King, and that was supporting him all the way through his life. The death of Dr. King was so dramatic that it caused activity all over the country because he was missed, because he offered so much in terms of hopes and dreams in his style of leadership. And so his sudden death, which may not just be attributed to his civil rights, but there are those of you here who know he was also very, very active and opposed to the war in Vietnam. And he, with young people who were protesting the war in Vietnam, he supported them and met a good deal of negative opposition from some people who had formerly supported him. That's another part of the story that many people may not know. But there were African Americans who didn't like the fact that Dr. King publicly was opposed to the war in Vietnam.
Those triple evils of militarism, racism, poverty that he was against. And you talked about that at the end of his life, but it's fascinating that you were long involved with these struggles before you started working with King. You were Dr. King Sr. by over a decade, and you had been involved with the labor movement, fighting poverty and discrimination, before you met Dr. King.
Well, there were those of us like Mr. Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. When I was growing up on the South Side, the story goes, and I tell that story quite often, I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, December the 7th, 1918, and those of you who have computers, you can tell how long. And so when I was 8 months old, the story goes, part of this is actual and part of it is humorous. 8 months old, things were so bad and rough with the Ku Klux Klan and the law. And I was 8 months old, and I looked around and saw what was happening in the South, and I said to my mama, with using the vulgarity, I won't use that, I'm going to leave here. So I brought my family to Chicago when I was 8 months old. And we settled on the South Side. Now I could actually walk from where we are now to, if I had the energy, to every place where I've lived in Chicago in those 99 years. But once upon a time, it seems incredible, but unless you were employed and lived in this neighborhood, except for this church, you were not welcome, even though you might have friends. And I had friends that I had graduated from elementary school, Burke Elementary School, white friends, who moved to Hyde Park. They could visit me, but I couldn't visit them. So that, in my experience, again, carried me to work with Dr. King. And when President Johnson asked Dr. King to come south on the housing issue, I was very, very much involved because housing had always been a factor in the North, and Chicago was considered at that time the most segregated northern city in the country. And we were out to break that barrier as much as possible.
So you invited Dr. King to Chicago, and brought him here in 1956, and then again in the 60s. Were you worried about his safety?
What?
Were you worried about how whether Dr. King would be safe in Chicago?
In a sense, I was worried all the time, not just in Chicago, but because of his firm attitude of passive resistance, I felt that somewhere that would break the sea. In the South, it worked because they expected blacks to fight back. They didn't know quite what to do when they didn't. But with Dr. King's attitude, I always worried how long he would be tolerated in this social system. And he was attacked not once. His house was bombed and burned. He was stabbed by a Negro woman in Harlem, New York. And so I kept always worried that his attitude and his behavior would eventually cause someone to attack him successfully. And that did happen in April the 4th, 1968.
1968, 50 years ago today at 6:01 p.m. And you heard the news and you were angry?
Oh, I was angry. I was so angry that my father at that time was ill, and I was visiting him at the hospital. There used to be a hospital in Woodlawn. And I got on the elevator. I was so angry and so hurt at this sudden assassination. And two police officers were on the same elevator, and they were giving signs of being happy that this troublemaker was no longer there. Troublemaker. I was so angry that when they laughed and said, you know, Martin Luther King has been killed, I said to them, I wish it had been you instead of Dr. King. And they got quiet. Now, I was that angry, I was that crazy, because I was so hurt that I didn't care at that immediate moment. I cared later. But fortunately, they just became quiet and let this old dumb guy alone. When I got into the room where my father was, though he was very ill, he said, you know, Martin Luther King has been assassinated. I can't understand why any bastard would do that to this man. Now, my daddy, who was a Marcus Garveyite, you may want to read about Marcus Garvey, was a black nationalist. And so he was very mad that Dr. King had been a pacifist against violence all this time. So it was a painful day, and immediately there began to be activities all over the country. Dr. King was beyond America because there were people all over the world who mourned his assassination. I know because I had friends that wondered about why that happened. He was a universal person, and he embraced psychologically all human beings. He marched as a black man because his feelings were, we exemplified the way in which race mattered, but we also had a responsibility to go forward with the idea expressed in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, putting in all human beings are created equal, are endowed by their Creator with life, liberty. That was the feeling, the spirit that that man carried, which was universal, but it became dramatized because he was also an African American, and his initial supporters, the obvious supporters, were also African American, but supported by all kinds of other groups.
And that universalism is an important part of his message for you. I want to get to a point where you might talk a little bit to some of the people involved in organizing these very important protests going on today. We're seeing so many of the same tensions. Dr. King, beginning really in 1966, was confronting advocates of the Black Power movement who had grown pretty disillusioned with the nonviolence that Dr. King preached. And by 1968, there was a great deal of dissent in the civil rights movement. A great deal of disagreement in the civil rights movement. And I think we see a lot of that today as well. How do you feel young people today who are doing these incredibly important things out there politically with the March for Our Lives protests and the Me Too movement, how do you feel that they can actually carry on King's legacy?
Well, the example is historic. Dr. King, that in India, Gandhi.
I guess I should say, would you urge nonviolence in this context?
I think that younger people, particularly those who were demonstrating about gun control, are exemplifying, carrying forward that history. They are against gun violence, and they are exemplified by confronting whoever might have a gun, saying, you, in a sense, that shouldn't be. So they are, whether they know it or not, they are following the legacy of Dr. King, and I believe that because of their composition, the diversity of the composition of those young people, college and high school, that they are going to have a political impact because they have mothers and fathers and older friends who share the memories of the stories of Dr. King and are very proud and supportive of their younger relatives and friends. I believe that. And I believe that we are going to have, because of the numbers that are involved, that we're going to find some, whether it's subtle or non-subtle, control of weapons, mass weapons. You see, though they find out themselves of various experiences, and on the University of Chicago, we just had an experience.
Yeah.
That if guns are available to anyone who wants them, their lives are in danger. So I think they're going to take the example that is inherited from Gandhi and King and some other leaders of bringing about that change in weapons of destruction. I'm concerned, personally, since I was in World War II and heard about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that also moving forward to the weapons, and Dr. King, I know where he would be, weapons of mass destruction, which are becoming more obtainable by all the nations. That mission of Dr. King needs to be carried forward into the population of those nations which are doing that in terms of their protection, but you threatening it against other countries. So I'm just saying that Dr. King's message is a universal message for the best of human beings all over the world.
Is it fair to say you still support those efforts at nonviolent protest, direct action, but you would also like to remind young people to vote?
Well, what we all need to understand, that politics is universal. Whenever, think about it, young people, whenever two people get together, politics begin. Somebody's going to make decisions about what's going to happen, who's going to get the necessities. Now, it can be a dictatorship or a partnership. Which do you choose in those relationships? King was for a universal partnership. And that's the reason so many ordinary people, understanding that, followed his style and his legacy. We now live more than that period when Dr. King was active in one world. The new technology, the new means of construction and destruction and communication. Now, there are no secrets hardly anymore. So, what we say and do, we must think of how that affects others, negatively or positively. That's a difficult question, more complicated than when Dr. King, but that idea still exists on how we can bring about peace on earth and goodwill. But I carry the spirit that also was put into song by Duke Ellington. And by the way, Duke Ellington played on this campus too. And he played in his sacred concert, I believe whatever God you think. I believe that God put sun and moon up in the sky. I believe that dark clouds are clouds just passing by. God, the Lord above, God Almighty, God of love, please look down and see our people through. Amen. Point being, Duke Ellington was also a universalist. And if you follow his music and his style, he too was a supporter of Dr. King. And that was true across art, music, and all the other styles of entertainment and living.
That's, you have so many wonderful stories, and it's so unfortunate that our time today with Professor Black is so short, but I can't resist getting in a plug for your forthcoming autobiography, Sacred Ground. I have the manuscript here in my hand. It is now in press with Northwestern University Press. We expect it to be out by Professor Black's 100th birthday next December. Thanks to the amazing efforts of the editors at Northwestern, to Sue Klonsky, who recorded many of these interviews. And if you want to hear all of these fascinating stories about the long history of the struggle for justice on the south side of Chicago from someone who's been there ever since the 1919 Chicago race riot, you have to get a copy of Sacred Ground. Sacred Ground is Professor Black's term for the south side here, the Bronzeville neighborhood, where he grew up and where so many of these amazing political figures emerged. Harold Washington, President Obama. What do you want to tell them about this book?
Charles White's collection will be at the Art Institute. He and I graduated from Burke Elementary School together years ago. But he was, like many, a talented person who needed the opportunity. And again, I say Dr. King was following a legacy because in that effort, in that struggle, he and Margaret Burroughs and many others as young people were inspired by the relationship, and that's where Hyde Park came from, between the liberal areas of Hyde Parkers, like,
right.
I could name some of them, but
we're pretty proud of that.
But their relationship, because art and music brought them together, and they felt a sense of unity that they transferred in their lives.
I think that comes through in your book, where the politics, the art, the music, the whole cultural life, the whole fabric of the South Side, right? Can't really tease it apart. It's all one big current pursuing, keeping that struggle going, the struggle for social justice that you've really exemplified in your life.
Yeah. What we have occurring now, particularly, is a class division that kind of separates across racial lines, and the class division is where we see the violence in class against other class. And that is a thing that educators and people related to it have to understand, the social and cultural differences. Days of my years, we felt unity across community. And because we had relationships across other lines, that was one of the easy things in Chicago for us to organize organizations like CORE, Congress for Racial Equality, and so forth. There was a standard for Dr. King when he come to places like Chicago, that they were already organized across racial and ethnic lines that he could gain, that he would have support on.
I think we're almost out of time. So last words for this audience. Again, what do you want to convey to all the young people out there, all the older people out there? How can we all be like you?
All of them are young, according to me.
Is it Dr. King's legacy is alive and well as ever?
Yes, it is not, it's alive but not functioning as well universally. And I think that's because of a breakdown in communication between generations that has happened with the occurrence. It would seem that it would be easier with the new communication. But days of Dr. King's years, we spoke to each other on a personal level in a more human category. So it has to be people who understand that breakdown in order to carry that legacy forward. And when that does happen, particularly young people, they're so glad to know because they do feel a sense of isolation from the past until some human being. And so I say to young people, older people too, go talk with your older relatives and learn from them what was happening when Dr. King was assassinated and before he was assassinated. They have stories to tell those young people that will be helpful to them. And looking at the future, what will the world be like when in the future? What kind of world do they want it to be? It's more complicated now than when Dr. King was carrying us on the marches. But it's the same planet that we have to live on. How do we want that planet to be in terms of human beings? Do we want it to be like Hitler? Or do we want it to be like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and others who wanted to be peace on earth and goodwill towards all human beings?
Well, you are living proof that we have to talk to the elders.
Thank you. I am so honored. Thank you for this opportunity, and I hope that something that I have tried to say has given you some thought about the present, the past, and the future, because you live in the present, you're going to be living in the future. How much of the past can you carry forward in an active way to make a better future for all human beings? Which is why this old man can't quit now.